All right, boys and girls, welcome back. Today we're going to continue on with part one, transformation of a continent. Except now we're going to be on lesson two of part one. It's a very long part. It came out to, I believe, about 18 pages. So there's no way that I was going to fit that all into just one lecture. So this second one, I had titled it Indian Removal and Assimilation. So the maps that we're going to be using are just the same maps. I just want to review them really quick with you. Here you have the United States in 1800. You see at this point the western border of the United States is the Mississippi River, but the United States does not yet expand westward beyond the Mississippi River into Louisiana territory. You still have Spain in control of today modern day Mexico, as well as the southern or the southwestern portion of the United States. And then you also have Canada that has its hand in this North American territory with its colony, Great Britain. By 1830, you can see that the United States does expand westward. We had purchased the Louisiana Territory in 1803, so we gain all of this land in what is today the central portion of the United States, what's known as the Great Plains. But Mexico, after gaining its independence, is in control of what is today the western portion of the United States and the southwest of the United States. And then by 1853, the United States expands from coast to coast. And this is this idea of manifest destiny, which is this belief that the United States should expand from coast to coast, and that this expansion westward across the entire continent was ordained by God, that it was endorsed by God, that it was our destiny to do so. All right, let's start out with answering the question, why was the War of 1812 a turning point in U.S.-Indian relations? Well, prior to the American Revolution, so we're going way back into the 18th century, so the 1700s at this point. 1776 was the Declaration of Independence. So prior to the American Revolution, the British had claimed the Northwest Territory. So this was this portion of what is today Illinois, but also Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin. This whole area was claimed by Great Britain. You could see that this map was August 7th, 1789, all the way to April 2nd, 1790. So we're not even in the 19th century at this point. So after the American Revolution is fought, the United States claimed this territory to themselves. So this was an area that now is in contention. Britain had still allied with Indian groups in the territory, and the aim was to keep the United States from expanding northward, expanding too close to their colony, Canada. So this brings about the War of 1812. Now there's several reasons as to why we fought Great Britain in the War of 1812, only a few years after we had fought Great Britain in the American Revolution. But one of the reasons was because Great Britain did not want the United States expanding westward or northward, because we would be encroaching upon their territory or encroaching upon their colony of Canada. So at the very conclusion of the War of 1812, Britain ends up agreeing to abandon their alliances with tribes in this region, and they agreed to this in exchange for this promise that the United States does not expand into Canada. Why is the War of 1812 significant? Well, this ended up signaling an end of European support for Native Americans that were opposing U.S. expansion. So Indian groups were now alone in their struggle to halt U.S. growth. And this brought about this idea of the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine was a belief that was created by President James Monroe, and he, in a speech to Congress, had warned Europeans against interfering in the Americas. So we're now talking the Western Hemisphere of the globe, North America, Central America, South America, outside of their present colonies. In other words, President James Monroe says that the Western Hemisphere is now American territory. This is the backyard of the United States, and the United States is in control of the Western Hemisphere. That Europeans should remain in the Eastern Hemisphere. And you see this depicted over in this political cartoon. To the left here, you have four different Europeans that are seemingly angry at these individuals on the other side of this body of water. This body of water is meant to represent the Atlantic Ocean. And then on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, you have some poorer looking individuals that represent Americans. And next to this man right here with a rifle, it says, "No trespass, America for Americans." This was this Monroe Doctrine that Europe, hey, you've been over in the Western Hemisphere for a little while now, but now you have this brand new nation, the United States. This is our territory, and we're controlling the affairs in our backyard from this point forward. So how did Indian groups respond to U.S. assimilation policies? In order to answer this question, I think it's worth defining what the term assimilation means. So assimilation means the gradual adoption of another culture, or an integration of your culture into another type of culture. So you can see this depicted here, where you have this Indian man in the photo to the left, has long hair, has earrings, has jewelry, a sash over a traditional Native American outfit. And then in the photo to the right, you see that this man has been assimilated into white American culture. He has a white American short haircuts. He's wearing a suit that is the traditional dress of white Americans. So in the early 1800s, the United States had supported this policy of assimilation. The government had conveyed to Indians that they had to become civilized, and I put that in quotations, by adopting white American customs, by converting to Christianity, and by becoming small farmers. The United States government wanted the land of these Indian groups, and we had said to these native tribes that if you want to stay in the territory, if you wanted to stay in this new country, then you had to adopt the culture of this new country. You had to forfeit your own culture and then become civilized. You had to become Americanized. Now, the issue with this is that assimilation is a slow process. This is not something that's going to take place in a matter of days, months, or heck, even years. That it takes a long time to adopt a culture that is not your own. The United States government, however, was under a lot of pressure to open new lands for settlement quickly. So many Indian groups had resisted the encroachment of white settlers. As these settlers had pushed westward, you had Indian groups had protested. These Indian groups had violently resisted at times, but also appealed to the U.S. government to protect the lands that have been their traditional lands for many, many years before these white Americans had even shown up to North America, arrived in North America is what I should say. But the issue is that there were no protections for Indian groups under U.S. or state laws. That Indian law was not respected. So even though these Indian groups had protested to the American judicial system, there were no protections for them, and these protests had fell on deaf ears. Other groups had found assimilation to be beneficial. Take the Cherokees, for instance. In the 1820s, the Cherokees had created a republic modeled on the United States government. What a republic is a system of government in which people elect representatives that act on their behalf in some sort of legislative body. We in the United States are a republic because we don't vote on every single proposed law. Rather, we elect representatives that then act on our behalf and construct laws for us. So the Cherokees had created a republic that was modeled on our U.S. system. The Cherokees adopted a constitution of their own. The Cherokees had participated in the booming cotton economy and even owned slaves that had worked their plantations. So it's very clear that the Cherokees were trying to adopt U.S. culture in some form or fashion, and they were trying to cater it to their own needs and interests. But so much of the white population in the South had felt threatened by this policy of assimilation, because this, how they interpreted assimilation was that these lands that they wanted would continue to be held by Indians, so long as these native groups had adopted American culture. And the white population in the South did not endorse this idea. They did not approve of the fact that these Indian groups would hold on to land that they desired. So most white Americans had believed that Indians were racially inferior. Inferior is a word that means lower in status, lower in rank, less than. They believed that natives were racially inferior and incapable of being civilized. Well, the United States government eventually gave in to the demands of this white population, land speculators, miners, and white settlers. What land speculators are, and I should mention what this means because here's a photo that depicts land speculators. Land speculators, these are a group of people that would buy up land with the hope that this land would increase in value in later time. So they would purchase the land for, let's say, $5, hoping that the land would increase in value to, let's say, $10 an acre or $15 an acre over the course of many years. So it's a way of making money. They gave in to the demands of land speculators. The United States gave in to the demands of miners, gold miners, and the United States gave in to the demands of white settlers. And so the United States government had constructed a new policy under Andrew Jackson, and President Andrew Jackson signed into law the Indian Removal Act. The Indian Removal Act is an act that called on any Indians residing in the United States or its territories to move west of the Mississippi River. The United States designated new lands for them and offered compensation or money to move. In all, there were 125,000 natives that were forced to move from their traditional lands west of the Mississippi River. So here you see the Mississippi River along my laser here, and You see groups like the Cherokees were forced from Georgia westward. The Creek Indians were forced across the Mississippi River. You had the Seminole were also forced west of the Mississippi River, as well as the Choctaw. So some groups had moved west with little resistance, but others had violently resisted the United States' attempts to take their land. Some groups, like the Cherokees, for example, had appealed to the Supreme Court of the United States. SCOTUS is how I abbreviate it in my slides, Supreme Court of the United States. Some Indian groups had appealed to the Supreme Court and said, hey, the United States is taking our land. This is land that we own. But once again, their appeals had fell upon deaf ears. The Supreme Court either did not accept their appeals or had rejected their appeals altogether. Some Indian groups had refused to sign removal treaties. The Cherokees had requested United States citizenship from the United States government, but the government refused to grant Cherokees U.S. citizenship and simply offered an ultimatum. An ultimatum is a word meaning a forced choice. You are either going to do this or you're going to do that. So in this case, you're either going to move west voluntarily or you're going to be forced west. We're going to force you west. And this is what led to the Trail of Tears. The Trail of Tears, very sad, but this is when you had federal troops had forced the Cherokees to leave their lands in Georgia, modern-day Georgia, and escorted them west in the middle of the winter. Of the 15,000 Cherokees that ended up making this journey from Georgia all the way to the west, 4,000 ended up dying from disease, exposure to the elements, meaning they had died from the cold, or malnutrition. Malnutrition means that they were not adequately fed. They had bad nutrition. So did the United States uphold treaties and promises that were made with groups that were forced west? The United States said, hey, if you move west, we'll designate territory in the Louisiana Territory for you. And they had labeled this territory Indian Territory. So let me jump back to the map here so that you can see what kind of territory we're talking about. The Louisiana Territory was this entire territory west of the Mississippi River, and all of this land was labeled Indian Territory. So you had Indian groups in the east were forced to move west, and as long as you moved west of the Mississippi River, then the United States government was going to respect you, your claim over land over there. However, by the 1860s, that giant territory, the Louisiana Purchase Territory, what was now Indian Territory, would shrink significantly to a territory that's pretty much the size of modern-day Oklahoma. And you can see that right here. This is the same map that was depicted in your book. It says Indian Territory, and you see every Indian group imaginable being forced into this small territory. All of these groups had initially spread all throughout the United States, and now they were being forced into this small little area. And when these Indian groups had moved west of the Mississippi River, these tribes often struggled to put their lives back together. They had created churches, governments, schools to the best of their ability, but really they were forced off their homeland, and they made the best of what they were given. So how did Indian groups respond to these U.S. settlers? Well, initially, most Indian groups did not see these new settlers as a threat. And you had Indians that often helped travelers find water holes, traded food supplies with the settlers, or guided settlers across unfamiliar terrain. But the scope and the speed of U.S. settlement had quickly increased tensions as Indian groups began to see newcomers as intruders. So, unlike earlier westward expansion, where settlers would simply march through Indian territory on their way to California or Oregon or Texas, now these U.S. settlers were staying and they were not leaving. So they were encroaching upon Indian territory that was promised to them by the U.S. government. And on top of that, these white settlers had brought disease. We discussed smallpox, chickenpox, uh, cholera, all these different diseases that were brought to native populations by white settlers. Uh, these white settlers depleted timber stocks, so they were chopping down the wood that would be used by native groups. White settlers hunted and frightened away game, game being a term that describes wild animals that are hunted for either sport or for food. And these white settlers also allowed their livestock to graze crops and grasses that fed Indian horses. So you really see this competition for resources between white settlers and native tribes. Why was there violence in the West in the second half of the 19th century? The 19th century describing the 1800s. So it soon became clear that the United States was not going to honor its commitments to preserve Indian lands. Settlers, land speculators, and lumberjacks were arriving in droves and murdered any Indians that tried to defend their lands. The U.S. government had sent troops to quell the violence. I think I spelled quell wrong there. To quell the violence. Um, However, they did face stiff opposition from groups like the Comanche and the Lakota. The Comanche and the Lakota Indians were also trying to expand their territory as well. So you saw violence occurring between the federal troops and the Comanche and Lakota tribes. And then they also, the U.S. government also faced opposition from the Apache and the Navajo in the southwestern portion of the United States, modern day Arizona and New Mexico. The Apache and the Navajo had led raids on U.S. troops. They led raids on the communities that were established by U.S. settlers. So it was clear that native tribes were not passively accepting U.S. westward expansion. Rather, most tribes did fight to retain possession of their ancestral homelands. However, the U.S. government sent in troops that really did dispossess these lands from these people in pursuit of manifest destiny. All right, that's all I got for you today. Hope you learned something, and I'll see you next time.